Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan. I'm an editor at Ahval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me today is Rachel Ellehuus. She is the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Rachel, pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to invite you on here because we had the NATO summit this week. It was President Biden's first NATO summit since coming to office, and you wrote together with Pierre Marcos a great article in War on the Rocks that talked about the need for NATO to begin taking its values more seriously. It's democratic, liberal, pluralistic values. And on Monday, when President Biden was there, he made a speech at the end of the day before speaking to the press, where he actually brought up this topic and emphasized the need, basically, for NATO to take it more seriously and for the member states to look to renew their own democracies, and send a message to the rest of the world that it can still work. And I want to talk to you more about your article first. And I want to talk to you more about your article, yes. But first, I want to get your take on Biden bringing up this topic at the NATO summit. What were your impressions?
Well, I would say that this theme of democratic values has become a hallmark of Biden's foreign policy. And he said on several occasions that the two can't be divided. And in fact, that one of the best defenses that the United States and its allies and partners has against those who are not living up to these values and principles is by setting a strong example. That in fact, a strong defense is the United States and its allies and partners abiding by those principles. So I think that had been seen in his interactions with China, certainly in messages towards Russia. So I expect you to continue to hear a lot about this as an integral part of the foreign policy and the US brand.
Do you think it was in any way a break from previous administrations, where usually these NATO summits tended to revolve around the more technical discussions, such as threat perceptions or, say, defense spending, which the Trump administration, the Obama administration before it, continually brought up at NATO summits to try to encourage other members to spend close to 2% on defense?
Well, of course, he addressed that as well, because it's important that if NATO has a certain level of ambition, that it's able to resource that. So he definitely spoke about responsibility and burden sharing and the importance of not just meeting the 2%, but also making sure that allies' contributions and what they're spending the money on is going to things that make NATO stronger. But in terms of values, if you go back and you look at most of the NATO communiques from summits and foreign and defense ministerials, in the very first paragraph, there is always a reference to the North Atlantic Treaty and the values and principles that underpin the alliance from its very inception. I think the problem is in, when you look at how unequally those principles have been upheld across the alliance, they're increasingly ringing hollow. So it's one thing to name check the treaty and those values and principles, but that's not very helpful when in reality, everybody can see that those are being undermined by NATO member states.
And there's a number of member states, of course, that are veering into this quote unquote illiberal direction that's calling into question whether or not the NATO alliance is actually an alliance of democratic states. And because it's Turkey abroad, of course, I would like to single out Turkey among them, because right before Biden made his speech, he had just finished his meeting with President Erdogan, his first of his administration, first of his presidency, rather. And I don't think that, of course, the mention about democracy was directly connected to that meeting, but it did make me think about how Turkey, in a way, of course, stands out in particular among the NATO member states for the way in which it's backslided so much on democracy under President Erdogan. And the Biden administration's called out Turkey since coming to office a number of times, and he brought up these topics. Surely in his meeting with President Erdogan. But does Turkey in any way to you represent something of a unique challenge on the question of how NATO is going to go about renewing its renewing democracy within itself?
Well, I would first say that, I know I will speak to Turkey, but Turkey is not alone. In fact, there are a number of allies who are guilty of this democratic backsliding, some more than others. But, certainly we've seen crackdowns on the judiciary in Poland and on media in Turkey, as well as Hungary and Greece. So they're not alone. And in many ways, you see them learning from one another. So a lot of the social media laws, for example, that Turkey has put in place look very similar to what we're seeing in India and Russia. So I think these guys learn from each other, which is why it's so important to address it across the board. With respect to Turkey specifically, I would say it's a challenge in two aspects. It's an internal challenge for the US and NATO and even the European Union, who say they are predicated on this respect for values. It's a blow to their credibility if they look the other way when Turkey is cracking down on its citizens. And if we ever see a Turkey, if we see elections in Turkey that bring about change, I think the US and NATO and the EU want to be on the right side of history as having held out those principles and defended those principles even when they were being threatened internally. But secondly, and what's really relevant for NATO is, something that I think is very recent with Turkey is we've always had disagreements. There have always been tensions in the relationship for the most part over time. But in recent years, I've seen Turkey kind of breaking an unspoken boundary in its behavior within NATO. So in the past, Turkey didn't block NATO business. They didn't take bilateral disputes with Greece, for example, and bring them into the alliance. And again, they're not the only one. We've seen tensions, for example, with Hungary blocking Ukraine's relationship with NATO and its membership action plan. But I think this, meddling in NATO business and undermining NATO's ability to deliver on its collective security mission is very problematic. And aside from the values aspect, there are some more concrete things like the purchase of the S-400, which does undermine NATO's collective defenses, which are, among other things, meant to defend Turkey.
Mm-hmm. On that note, I'd like to move over to the article that you co-wrote for War on the Rocks. And you, Pierre, offered a few suggestions on how NATO could incentivize its members to really protect their democracies. And it does make me think about the debate that goes on within the European Union, of course, how they address concerns about democratic backsliding in some of those countries that you mentioned too, like Poland and Hungary, are the first ones that come to my mind there. And they also have to deal with that when it comes to backsliding within countries that aspire to join the EU, like in this case, Turkey. And of course, they still haven't found the perfect solution to address any of this. And it does bring it back to NATO. It does make me think also how, for much of its existence throughout the Cold War, NATO has really tolerated at points these less than democratic practices among its members, whether it was Portugal was a founding member at a time when it was still under a dictatorship. There was the Greek military junta, and of course we had a number of military coups in Turkey as well. And in the end, the alliance chose solidarity rather than wading into these internal issues. But do you think NATO has enough leverage available to it that it could be successful in holding backsliders to account without undermining cohesion, or at least cohesion further?
Well, as we point out in the article, it's a delicate balance and it's a difficult problem for NATO because on the one hand, there is risk in shining a spotlight on this backsliding within the alliance. There is no provision to suspend an ally or to kick them out of the alliance. So the few tools that NATO would be left with is, monitoring the adherence to these values and principles, and then raising the political cost of breaking them. And in order to do that, they have to draw on these incentives and disincentives that you mentioned. But NATO operates by consensus. So the risk lies in the fact that if you punish an ally or hold an ally accountable, they could then retaliate on an unrelated matter that also requires consensus. So there's definitely risk. But in the grand scheme of things, I think the greater risk is not addressing the democratic backsliding. It undermines NATO's credibility for aspirant countries who may want to join the alliance. It undermines NATO's brand and credibility when it wants to engage overseas and help strengthen unstable governments. And then finally, the new element that we're seeing or shining a light on is the fact that adversaries are deliberately targeting these types of societal vulnerabilities to propagate malign influence, disinformation, and corruption. So left unaddressed, I think that risk is far greater than some of the tensions that will inevitably arise as NATO focuses more on addressing the democratic backsliding aspect.
Mm-hmm. And we absolutely could see how that really fit into the entire arc of President Biden's trip to Europe, because he began with the G7 meeting and then continued to meet allies throughout his trip before ultimately ending up in Geneva, where he had his summit with President Putin and Russia. And Russia, of course, naturally comes to mind immediately as one of those countries that has successfully tried to exploit these internal weaknesses within these NATO member states. And they've done the same, of course, with Turkey too. They've managed to find ways, whether it was 30S-400 or cooperating with Turkey further afield, to use them as a spoiler within NATO. But one question that just came to me actually is that NATO as a military alliance it's clear cut on how that functions. But do you think that now with this new focus on, say, protecting the internal cohesion and making sure that the member states remain functional, do you think NATO still has to grow into itself as a political alliance, like it has as a military alliance?
Well, you're right to point out that NATO is both a political and military alliance, and also that the political element has been somewhat underutilized. And in fact, at the summit earlier this week, I'm losing track of time, that one of the points of agreement that's listed in the communique is agreement to enhance the political consultation mechanism of the alliance that rests in what I believe is Article 4. So that certainly does help set the stage for greater cooperation. I think those consultations are important in diffusing conflicts, in getting everybody on the same page, and heading off Article 5. In fact, with regard to Turkey, we've seen Article 4 and political consultation used to discuss their concerns about Syrian and Russian missiles coming across their southern border, and Turkey's concerns about its security. So allies were able to convene and talk about the nature of that threat and what NATO's response might be, which in this case was active fence, which put some Patriot and SAMP-T batteries along that border. So we've seen this political consultation mechanism used before, but certainly it becomes more relevant, not only in that context, but in talking about issues like climate and emerging and disruptive technologies, which are newer to the alliance and where there isn't a lot of consensus or understanding of the specific role that NATO plays vis-a-vis other institutions and member states.
Mm-hmm. And before I move on to the next question, I would also like to correct myself on the date that I gave. Wednesday was actually the Biden-Putin summit, but I believe you were speaking about Monday's NATO summit.
The 14th, yes.
But I
just don't know what week it is.
Fine, it's so much happening at once, between summits here, summits there. I'm still trying to get my bearings together on all of them as well. Yeah,
that's right. So it was Monday, the 14th of June.
That's right. And then European summit, then Putin summit. But I also wanted to move on to something in your article that you mentioned, and that was the deterrent effect of the quote unquote bad ally label. And some members, of course, might already see Turkey as the poster child of that bad ally. whether it was because of the invasion in Syria in October 2019, or of course the purchasing the S-400, saber rattling in the East Mediterranean, or more recently the watering down the Ryanair statement related to Belarus. These it would argue are within Turkey. Would argue are within its national interest, even if it comes at the expense of NATO unity. And in your article, it is mentioned about the dilemma of prioritizing values while still preserving unity among NATO allies. And an approach is offered that would stop NATO's involvement in disagreements from being counterproductive. Why would this approach deter the type of divisive unilateral moves made by member states like Turkey and get them to really think twice or think about themselves and how their actions will affect, say, in this case, the wider alliance?
Well, one of the reasons that I believe, Turkey has behaved so aggressively in its own region lately is because it feels that NATO is not necessarily addressing what it sees as these legitimate national security concerns.
On Monday also.
Right. So it doesn't excuse the behavior. And I would argue that Erdogan should sort of try harder to build consensus in the alliance and to explain to those allies what the nature of the threat is. But when you're a member of a collective security organization, sometimes it does require you to subsume national interest to the collective good.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, though, that Turkey and some of their disruptive actions sometimes, like whether it was in Syria or the S-400, isn't necessarily thinking about the impact on NATO, even if that is felt, given the multitude of concerns other member states might have about their actions, and more as a proxy sometimes to its disagreements over the years with the United States, and basically kind of how it's continuing a long history of really playing these great powers against one another to maximize its room for maneuver. Like in this case, like between its dealings with the US and Russia in the past couple of years or so. What do you think?
That's a difficult question, and hard to sort of unravel and isolate the connections between all these things. So I think the problem is if countries can behave in a way that doesn't have any consequences, of course they will keep repeating that behavior, right? So if Turkey feels that it can intervene in Syria unilaterally to protect its security concerns, and then nobody sort of criticizes that behavior in a way that has meaningful consequences, of course they will do it again. So to our piece, part of this is calling out the behavior and taking sort of a lesson from child rearing. You don't label somebody the bad child or the bad ally. Instead, you focus on the behavior that is undesirable. And try to change that with these incentives.
Mm-hmm. And the last question I would like to ask you really is, if we take Erdogan and his advisors at their word, they do still consider NATO to be valuable and essential to protecting Turkish national security. And they insist, as you mentioned, and in the previous question, that in your previous answer rather, that Turkey has felt like the alliance does not really take its unique security concerns that seriously. And there's reason, of course, to believe that after the last several years or so in which Turkey's acted increasingly aggressively and asserting itself very unilaterally in a number of different theaters, that there's a good chance they might continue on this course down the line. But do you think that it would be necessary, basically, for NATO to develop something of a greater tolerance and better management of this short-term disunity, if it means upholding the NATO's democratic values, while at the same time keeping the alliance together?
Well, I mean, ideally, that's the balance that you strike. And insofar as this process doesn't necessarily exist for holding allies accountable, I think the best move would be for the alliance to put something in place. And one of the things we recommended was linking it to the resilience metrics. So NATO focuses a lot on resilience, and that's concrete things like resilience of critical infrastructure and communications networks and supply chains, but it's also societal resilience. And so I think that, the framework for addressing this in a way that strikes that balance that you mentioned is there, but it will have to be sort of adjusted and tweaked over time, because it is quite difficult to achieve.
Very delicate balance that we'll hopefully be able to see some progress made on soon. But now that we've reached the end of the program, I would like to thank you, Rachel, for taking the time to join Turkey Abroad today. And I really do hope to have you back sometime in the future.
Thanks very much. You're reaching out to an important audience, so I'm happy to be here.